All right, greetings and welcome to the first Curse of Politics podcast intro written by the new ChatGPT AI program. Hi there, David Herle here. I have Scott Reid, Jordan Leichnitz and Kory Teneycke here too. We'll be digging into the ins and outs of the political world from the spin room to the polling booth. So grab a glass of your favorite beverage, sit back, relax, and get ready to hear some hard-hitting political takes. Let's get this party started. It's time to break the curse of politics. Hey, Jesus, guys, that wasn't any less cliched than our regular intros. Maybe this fucking AI shit works after all. I don't know. Although I am not from Winnipeg, Manitoba. AI wrote a political biography of me yesterday. Said, Jordan, that I was not only from Winnipeg, Manitoba, but I started in politics as a researcher for the NDP. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Gave you a promotion.
There we go. And he's a graceful dancer.
And I am the magic behind Dalton McGuinty. So, let's see. Here's the rundown for today. Healthcare battles are raging between the provinces and the feds amidst COVID, flu season, RSV, strained ICUs. We'll use our curse clipping, Robert Benzie and Reza Patel's piece in the Star about the provinces demanding a meeting with Trudeau to talk about that. Ford's approval ratings are down. Is he worried about it? Is it the expected ebb and flow of political popularity? Are we about to see another compelling cheesecake video? And then we'll do an NDP check-in. Just about 9 months into the confidence and supply agreement, do they still have confidence in it? And then Gordon Pinsett will show up to remind us to get the fucking hey yous already. Scott, Kory, Jordan, it's great to see you.
Great to be seen.
Glad to have you back, Jordan and Scott.
You're backlit, Kory. You're backlit. I can't see the definition in your features, and that robs me of an essential aspect of my Monday morning. So.
I'll message you a picture.
That would be great. Thank you. Post it on your OnlyFans account.
Maybe we should get off, David. I feel like an intruder here.
Oh, I know. It's become very personal. All right, let's start with the NDP. Scott, you interviewed Jagmeet Singh on the radio last week, right? I had three journalists on the Hurly Burly last week for an hour talking about what's gone on in politics in the last year. And if the NDP were mentioned, they were barely mentioned. I saw a round of interviews that Singh did, as you were part of it, I guess, round of interviews through the weekend. The message I got from it was mostly why they are continuing to support the government. Out of those interviews, that's what the media boils those things down to. And I'm just wondering, Scott, I'll start with you, about are the NDP as far out of the conversation as I think they are? And if they are, what can they do within the confines of this confidence and supply agreement to get back into the conversation?
I think the confidence and supply agreement is a contract that guarantees relevancy in the House and in policy terms and in agenda terms for the NDP. But it's also a contract that handcuffs their ability to agitate. And that seems paradoxical because you'd think, well, they have more leverage than ever before. But I thought the interviews highlighted it. Jagmeet Singh asked for the interviews, right? I was co-hosting on News Talk 10 a.m. This is on the radio, as you call it. This is a terrestrial-based form of mass broadcasting that existed in the 20th century. Yeah, it was really, really big at one time. But now it's just me and him listening, actually. But what I was struck by is he wanted to talk about healthcare. And, and there were the same kinds of political, like I asked him, when will you pull the plug? Will you ever pull the plug? Well, we're just here to get things done. And I'm not thinking about that. Okay, fine. And asked him if he would compete in the next election. And he said, I went to Germany to learn how the Social Democrats there won the election. So I'm on my tank's filled, man. I got all kinds of new good winning ideas. I'm going to really crack it. So no, I'm going to run forever. But what struck me was that he didn't have anything. His entry into the discussion on healthcare, was sensible insofar as he's saying things that a lot of people would nod their heads at, right? Look, we got to do something about staffing. Wouldn't it be better if we had a national approach? Why can't we get the prime minister sitting down with the provinces, negotiate a money deal, but also negotiate some urgency around human health resources, that sort of thing. But the problem was that it was as thin as a plate of soup, because as soon as I'd push and say, well, but the battle that's currently going on is that the premiers refuse to even accept that they should be directed to spend any new transfer money on healthcare, much less permitting, prioritization of that kind or specific funds or a national program with respect to hiring. It's just not, it's not on. And he was just like, well, I just think that that's where we have to try. And again, in identifying a priority that people care about, sure, it's on the numbers. But in terms of entering the discussion in any place that lasts for more than 30 seconds, it was kind of pointless. And so I think the NDP, I think they've got to get more rigorous. I think that Jagmeet Singh needs to get more rigorous. And of course, the challenge there is he can only agitate so hard before people say, well, why don't you fucking do something about it? If you're so wound up about this issue, right? Why don't you kick the chair out from underneath Trudeau, and he'll be swinging. So you've got the ultimate hammer, and that puts them in a bind. And so I find that they're kind of, the sidecar discussion to the government. And I guess that's the way it always is in these sort of minority situations where you strike a deal. But I think that Singh has got to find a way to more substantively enter the conversation, because just saying, well, we need more money on healthcare, but I would strike a deal, a national deal that clearly is not possible. It goes nowhere, and no one takes it seriously. And so then they just walk past him when they want to talk about it next time.
Jordan, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think the confidence and supply agreement has baked into it a pretty difficult political balance, because Singh needs to find wins in order to justify the continued existence of the agreement. But as Scott said, obviously, if you agitate too much on one point, then you risk needing to, or painting yourself into a corner and needing to blow the whole thing up. And so I think there's a discipline there where the party needs to continue to push for and obtain some wins, some things on their wish list. It's not always going to completely align with what the government has. So, if they're wishing for A, B, and C, maybe the Liberals come to the table with C. And I think that that's what we're seeing with the gains that they have this year, everything from the GST rebate to the rent checks to the start of the dental plan. That's not A, B, and C. That's C, right? But it does provide a concrete basis for continuing the agreement. And it provides the thing that, if we go back to the start of this agreement politically, we know New Democrats are looking for, which is a governing record. So they are looking to make the argument that when you elect more New Democrats, you are going to get more good stuff. So they need proof points on that. So I think he's collecting some of those. And I think that they need to continue to suggest that when there is a greater New Democrat presence, you will get more things off of that wish list. And so that's the art in doing that. Now, as to the healthcare piece and whether the engagement is substantive enough, I think it's always tricky particularly when you're the fourth opposition party, to come in with detailed policy-oriented solutions. There's not a lot of space for that. But I do note something in his approach that I think is interesting and does show a little bit more discipline than sometimes the party has had in the past, which is that they're tracking pretty closely on issues of concern with public opinion. We saw through the fall really tight discipline on cost of living, rising grocery prices, naming who's responsible, in that case, profiteering from large grocery companies. And now, just as at the beginning of December, we see that healthcare is now topping unprompted the list of concerns for Canadians. So, and I believe Nanos was showing that as at a 2-year high. They're making a pivot, and they're putting him out there doing a push this week, for example, on pediatric hospitals and wait times. So whether or not the actual solutions are the ones that are workable at the table, ultimately, I think it's not necessarily his job, right? He's not sitting at the table. His job is to point out where the prime minister is missing and to try to occupy that space and drive the conversation a little bit. So as far as that goes, I think it's, as good a gambit as any, particularly at this time of the year. I think that next year is going to be a different stage for the agreement, though. This year was a bit of the warm up, and next year things are going to get a little bit more serious. There's baked into the agreement the need to move from basically what is the introduction of the dental care program to a much more robust one. Next year is where pharmacare comes due. These are some of the bigger and more complex pieces. So we're going to have to see how it all holds together through that.
Time for a happy story, hurly-burlyites. 'Tis the season, so it's about giving. Specifically, it's about giving hope. And the story begins with a girl named Olivia, living out in Edmonton. Some years ago, Olivia was diagnosed with Rett syndrome, a genetic condition where a child progressively loses speech, movement, and coordination of the body. But I said this was a happy story, and here's why. Olivia's life has been changed recently as a result of a local community grant from the TELUS Future Friendly Foundation to the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital Foundation. She has a new piece of technology straight out of the lab called a BCI, Brain Computer Interface. It's a specialized headset connected to Olivia's brain that takes her neural signals and turns them into commands. Literally, it turns her thoughts into action. So Olivia is now able to push and pull objects like a ball to paint with or use to play with her sister and pet dog. She's even learning to control her wheelchair with BCI, engaging physically with her family and others in ways she never could before. Olivia's is just one giving story of the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation, an independent registered charity that believes all youth, regardless of their circumstances, deserve an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. In 2022, there have been 548 such stories, totaling over $10.5 million. Next week, we'll tell you another, but it's giving season after all, and you can learn more about the foundation right now at friendlyfuture.com. Scott Reid taught me many years ago that public interest and media interest are driven by conflict. And where's the conflict in this relationship? I mean, how much scope, Kory, maybe you can jump in here, does Singh have to be a critic of the government while he supports it? I mean, the interviews he does, he tries to draw a fine line. He gives both messages, but the message the media take is we're supporting them. You're supporting them, and you're fine with them. And, as long as that's the case, I think people tune out.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I think it's true about what you're saying about conflict, but I think it's ultimately understood and perceived by the public that the people making the decisions are the Liberal cabinet and the Liberal government, not this agreement, not Jagmeet Singh. And so the focus goes to where the decisions are made, and the credit goes to the people who make the decisions. So, I think it's a fundamentally a losing argument from the get-go. It's a theory. It's just not one that we've ever seen really work and drive votes. I think he's setting himself up to be Liberal lunch in the next election, and that's not a break from the past. I think that's a continuance of patterns that we've seen in politics and federal elections time and time again when it comes to these sorts of détentes or this theory, which I just don't think we've ever actually seen perform in practice. Maybe this will be the first time. I won't negate that there's a possibility that Jordan could be right here, that the NDP could be right, but I think it's challenged very strongly by a lot of historic examples, and so it's a tough one. I also think it's talking about pharmacare and dental care when the primary healthcare system is in a state of crisis is talking about a car with the engine isn't working very well and it's sputtering down the road and saying, oh no, we got to bring it in and get some add-ons. We need a new stereo system in this thing, and we need to have add-on extras, maybe some underglow lighting and some spinner hubcaps or something. It's just, these are things that are not connected to what the actual problems are that you're hearing from premiers of every stripe. So before we add new entitlements to the suite of entitlement programs around healthcare in the country, can we get the primary system working properly, which is dramatically underfunded? I think it'd be better to be saying, sit down with the premiers, get a sustainable long-term funding agreement in place. That's actually what every premier who is running a healthcare system is asking for. So I don't know. I think it's dubious.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what he's asking for this week, actually. So, I noted some overlap between Singh's ask was basically for a FedProv meeting with First Minister's meeting, and that's actually what the premiers are asking for. So I think he's driving in that direction.
Which premier is asking for healthcare and pharmacare? In fact, they're all asking for the opposite. They're all saying, let's fund what we are doing now. Every premier has been rejecting a national pharmacare program since it's been proposed.
Well, but that's not true, Kory. And the other thing to remember about that is that drug costs are actually the fastest growing costs within each and every provincial health system. So, a national plan will actually have some impacts there. But I want to turn back to the political question, which is I think that, for New Democrats, one thing that we know through painful experience is that when voters are offered a choice, they would love to be able, many voters would love to be able to vote Liberal with a side of New Democrat. They would love to be able to vote for that. They would like to be able to vote Liberal.
Not me.
Not you. I was going to say you above all. Surely, Scott. We welcome you to the
vote for a double helping a Liberal.
Yeah,
that's what they tend to vote for. So, if everyone wanted to have that, Jordan, I think you'd see that outcome in elections far more frequently than you do. What you normally see is a late stage of the campaign collapse the NDP vote behind the Liberals, usually on some sort of scare campaign that Scott and David or one of their buddies.
Well, those are people. What we're doing with those people, Kory, is we're going after people that would prefer the NDP to the Liberals, but can't accept the Conservatives.
Correct.
Those are voters we go after at the end.
Right. Now, in what universe do we realistically think that it's going to be a choice between Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre and Prime Minister Jagmeet Singh? Like, I just don't see that as being ultimately the ballot question. And at the end of the day, Canadians who go to the ballot box try to choose who they want to have be the government, and that's I think the fundamental flaw in the strategy, and that's why I think it never works.
Well, that's almost an argument that there ought not to be a third party. Ultimately, like I don't know where I'm going to be I'm going to be a dick here. You'll be astonished, but I'm going to be a dick.
Really, I'm going to lean in for this now.
Yeah, but right. I mean, I think
tune in.
I think when it comes to these political arrangements that the NDP try to manage in minority circumstances, I really think that the ghost of Jack Layton haunts the party in a way that's unhelpful, and by that I mean I fucking know he haunts me in 2005, obviously, but I think that 2011 allowed New Democrats to persuade themselves that the solution to the perpetual challenge of how do you prop up a Liberal government and actually accrue credit, the 2011 experience, people convinced themselves around Layton that was a dividend from 05 and that period there, and that because they had actually were able to achieve policy gains, that built up Jack, and then that gave him cred, and it put him on a track that was like one step follows this next step and then that step. And I don't think any of that's true. And I think that that's created a circumstance where, I mean, I think
it works if somebody chooses Ignatius.
Yeah,
right. That's what I think. Ignatius got lucky, and there was a big hole in Quebec, and he caught fire. Yeah, he had Ignatius, and he caught fire. But I think it's consequential though, because then what it means is that like Singh just keeps saying the same. He keeps using this line though. He keeps saying, well, we're just here to try to get things done for people, and the implication is, and therefore we will be rewarded. And I think that the challenge for the NDP, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what I would do in their place, because you will be blamed if you force an election, but you'll also likely not be able to accrue the credit that you maybe even arguably deserve for pushing the prime minister to expand the agenda, if in fact you think those things are popular, which I think is not 1,000% certain. But I don't know what else to do. But I think the New Democrats fool themselves often. They'll say, well, we're going to follow the path of Jack, not David Lewis and Bob Rae. But you know what? It's your Bob Rae and David Lewis. That's the truth of it, and that's where this thing feels like.
Jordan, I don't want to cut you off. I want to hear what you have to say, but I'd like you to, in your comments, try to address my question here, which is, what do I not understand about the power relationship between these two entities? Because I would have thought the NDP have a lot more clout than they're exhibiting right now. The Liberals do not want a fucking election right now. They do not. And they won't for the next year or so until we get through this economic mess. They're going to have to do something on healthcare at some point. Like, I don't understand why the NDP aren't more aggressively pushing the government on things like that.
Well, I think
putting the agreement ostensibly at risk if the government doesn't act on those things.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, frankly, that's what I see happening. You know, Singh going out this week on that this is a pivot. This is stuff that's not in the agreement, right? Him going out this week demanding that meeting. This is all off what is in the basic agreement. So I do see them making a turn in that direction. But of course, you can only push the big red button once, right? So it would be important for him to line that up and to make it meaningful. And I think that the runway that they're looking towards is obviously the budget. And all of the signals that are coming out from the Liberals as well is that's where they would be looking towards too, if there's going to be any sort of an agreement. So ideally, you want to ask the question that politically you know that there's going to be a positive answer to, so that you don't have to push the big red button. So I think that that's a little bit what we're seeing there. Now, you know, I do want to go back to the, you know, what is the lesson of Jack Layton and how do New Democrats understand that? Because I think very clearly within the party, the legacy and the lesson of Jack Layton is that New Democrats are there to win government. That was his ethos. That was a change that he brought to the party. And that's something that is ultimately the takeaway from his time there. I don't think that people necessarily see 2011 as a direct outflow of 2005. I think anyone who was there recognizes that circumstances played a huge role in what happened. But of course, luck is circumstances meeting preparation, right? So you had to have the exact right mix of things happening. I don't know if the confidence and supply agreement is the exact right mix of things, but what I do know is that the NDP has parlayed a position of relative weakness as a fourth party into one of significant influence, and one that's also keeping the country and notably themselves out of an election until everybody's perhaps a little bit more ready for that and the terrain is more favorable for them. So given, you know, I think the good is not the enemy of the best in some of these things. And they have to make that day-to-day negotiation about making that agreement work well for them. And for now, that really means, I think that Singh is earnest when he talks about delivering results, because for him, that is the best takeaway out of this circumstance. So we'll see how that holds into the spring. But I do think that we're starting to see a little bit more of an edge on it. And if you listen to the interviews this week, he, you know, and with you, Scott, as well, he said it openly, you know, like, I hope it doesn't come to this, but I will pull the plug on healthcare if I need to. So they're going now.
Okay.
You know,
well, if they say it like they mean it, because I'll tell you, I have no idea what the Trudeau people are thinking. But if I was in their positions, I suspect that you could play chicken with me with more confidence than Singh is doing it right now.
And I'll tell you what I would do differently, Jordan, for what it's worth. It goes back to what I was saying at the outset, and this is just my opinion, and maybe I'm dead wrong. I think he needs to be more specific. I think that when he comes forward and he says, listen, and if the end of it is, as you say, him going, well, and if we can't get real results, then I won't hesitate to pull the thread. But when that is built around a proposal of doing something that will not happen, that cannot happen, and that I don't believe for one moment he will actually bring down the government for not doing, and that is, you know, negotiating a series of national deals on top of healthcare, when the whole debate that very day with the premiers coming out was, you know, whether or not you could even get them to direct it towards, you know, commit to spending the money on healthcare. I think that the imprecision of it, the generality of it, I think it takes the sting out of the out of the threat. And so I'd be more specific. I would say, I want to see this very thing done. And if this thing isn't done by February 1st, well, then I'm going to bruise you. But asking for something that isn't going to happen, isn't much of a threat, in my opinion.
Well,
all right. You know what?
Theory here.
Go ahead.
In terms of what's going on and what will happen in the next election campaign, either it's going to be a change election or it's not. Either people want to change the government or they don't. Like, that's going to happen. And so, and that will be the overwhelming, you know, compulsion within the electorate, or it won't be, right? And if it is a change election, then, you know, an NDP government would be, you know, the difference between, you know, a dark beige and a really, really light brown. Like, it's just such a subtle, you know, palette a color palette difference in terms of the complexion of the government. Change elections tend to be about bolder ideas and bolder direction changes, and a desire to change both the people and also the agenda and what the focal point is. And I think if that happens, it'll be a tack towards economic issues, a tack towards focusing on those sorts of fundamentals as opposed to values issues and social policy. And one party is going to come out of that or ahead or not, but it's very difficult for me to see how there's space for the NDP in that race, and why I think you're seeing the media not focus on it, and it's not really a part of the day-to-day conversation here on the street, is because voting for the NDP is not going to be a change in direction. And so I just fail to see how that's going to happen. If you want to talk about 2011, all right. So if you're halfway through a reasonably popular conservative government's administration, and you're running against the weakest liberal leader in several generations, there's more space to vote for the NDP. But it's more of a commentary on the weakness of the Liberal Party in that particular case than it is anything else.
There's one example actually just occurred to me as you were talking, and it is the Reid victory, in which an election turned out to be a change election in the middle of the campaign. People didn't realize it when it was called that it was a change election, but it turned out to be a change election. And people decided, for whatever reasons at that time, it's less obvious to me in retrospect, that the Conservatives were an unacceptable choice. And so their vehicle for change was Reid and the NDP. So I continue to think that there's a danger for Poilievre in not being in positioning himself in a way that he's not able to scoop up those votes. And if that were to happen, then there's potential. There's a historical example. But in general, Kory, I would agree with your point. So you'll have a fair amount of grain terminology floating around in your head. We all do. You can make the grade. You can blow off steam. You might have bought a new car with all the bells and whistles. Sidetracked, third rail, wrong side of the tracks, blowing smoke, fast-tracked, railroaded, just the ticket. The end of the line. Sabotage. Yes, sabotage is actually a railroad term from France. You can look it up. I could go on. Fact is, railroading language has infiltrated English so thoroughly that you probably don't even know when you're using it. Interesting, eh? Anyway, the folks at our sponsor CN know a thing or two about railroad terms, and their favorite one at the moment is another oldie: leaving the station on time. The thing is, at CN, they mean it literally. Come hell or high water, as one of our former prime ministers liked to say, CN trains leave the station on time. Period. In the past year, leaving the station on time and arriving on time has become a prime directive of the railway. It's actually more complicated than it sounds. CN basically has one set of tracks connecting the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico. In some places, there are sidings for trains to park on, and other parts of the network are double-tracked. But it's not like a 6-lane highway. Leaving the station on time means making sure the tracks ahead are clear and coordinating the dozens of 2-mile-long trains rolling along the network at any given moment, not to mention making sure they're loaded on time and there's someone waiting to unload them at the other end so they can start another long haul. But CN has been doing it, and as a result, the velocity of CN's trains haven't been as good in years. To most of the world, velocity means speed, but to a railway, it means the average number of miles its trains cover in a day. And what that crucial number means is good service, as in, making the trains run on time. Where service is concerned, CN has sort of a one-track mind, tunnel vision even. And it seems to me like we should move on to healthcare, because this conversation about the NDP is moving heavily into that area. So let me just read a little bit. We've got music for this. All right. Let me just read a little bit from Rob Benzie and Reza Patel's piece in the Toronto Star. Canada's premiers are demanding more federal money from Ottawa for healthcare, and they want a face-to-face meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to make their case. The provincial and territorial leaders appealed to Trudeau on Friday for a First Ministers meeting early in the new year to tackle the funding crisis in a pandemic-battered system. While the federal government is willing to increase the Canada Health Transfer, it has repeatedly stated any commitment would come with strings attached to ensure the additional dollars go toward measurable improved health outcomes for Canadians instead of flowing into provinces' general revenues. Responding to the Premier's Federal Health Minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, by the way, he impresses me, people should keep their eye on him in my view, declined to say whether Trudeau would agree to convening the meeting. The Prime Minister will obviously do what he wants to do. What he has asked me to do, is work with my colleagues, health ministers, to agree on the results and put, therefore, the ends before the means, Duclos told reporters. But he said there are conditions that must be met to achieve that goal, such as supporting healthcare workers and patients, investing in home care, mental health care, and long-term care, and implementing a modern health data collection system. Duclos said his provincial and territorial counterparts have agreed to those conditions in private, and that it is now up to premiers to let us do our job and express publicly the type of outcomes and results that we need to achieve together. Kory, how is this going to end up?
It's going to end up with a healthcare deal, I think. The notion that premiers aren't going to spend money on healthcare flies in the face of evidence. It's half of what every province is spending its money on already. It's where the largest cost pressures are. It's where the largest amount of true need and public pressure is coming from. So, I think that's where the money is going to be spent. So I think it's a total red herring to say, oh well, we're not sitting down and having these meetings because they're never going to agree to have any strings attached. I just don't think that's true. I think what provinces are actually saying around that is they don't want to have the federal government trying to micromanage a healthcare system, which it has no experience managing and has very little window into what the specific needs of different provinces are. I think there's also a view amongst provinces, and this has come out, in some of the discussions you've had, David, with former premiers and health ministers on the Herle, where the idea that one size fits all means that you have something that fits everyone poorly, and there are very, very different needs. And for instance, the great province of Saskatchewan that has a small population that's geographically dispersed than there is in the GTA. There's just different needs in a different system that exists in different parts of the country, and so any sort of agreement needs to be cognizant of that. Where I think the federal government's on a good road and tying to some factors is more around reporting and information, so that the public in various jurisdictions and the federal government and policymakers, including in the provinces themselves, can have some metrics by which they can compare progress, and to have a bit of a laboratory of provinces that are trying different things and seeing what results are working and allowing provinces to emulate one another in areas of success. So I think that's all smart policy and all stuff that's good. Where I think things go sideways, and this is what's my big beef with Singh's putting of new entitlement programs on the table, is the current system is dramatically underfunded, and and we are not awash in money in provinces or in the federal government right now. I think it's focus on the core business, focus on the primary healthcare system, focus on hospitals, focus on wait times, focus on the things that we're doing now that are where the needs are the most acute. And there's a deal there to be had. I think what's going on is trying to time it politically for the federal government around when the next election is going to be, and trying to have that pop going into the polls. I think that's what's going on. There's no reason why the federal government shouldn't have sat down in the last 2 years with the provinces to have face-to-face discussions on this between first ministers. I think it's very difficult to explain why the federal government wouldn't do that, but they haven't. So they should.
I would be very surprised if every incremental federal dollar went to healthcare, to be honest, because one of the reasons that the provinces are so angry about the share that they have to bear of healthcare costs is because it crowds out their other spending. So it's not that they literally don't have the money to do it. It's that they don't have the money to do that, and roads the way they'd like to do them, and education the way they'd like to do that, and something else the way they'd like to do that. So they're looking for spending. They're not just looking for incremental health dollars. They're looking for a different arrangement that provides them with more flexibility with their own budgets, I think. But let me get back to politics. Scott, who has the moral high ground here? The provinces or the feds?
Probably nobody has moral high ground, but I think that the federal government has leverage on this fundamental question as long as the provinces continue to let it be framed the way it is, which is, will you or will you not accept the proposition that this money would be spent on healthcare. That's the way it's currently framed, and when the premiers can't say yes, that's a problem. So I'll get two stories to illuminate this, because that's really my job, is to cast a glow of soft white light over things, and so that they are more easily understood. First, we know that premiers' hesitation to say that they'll commit all the dollars to healthcare is well founded. Kory says, well, you don't need to worry about that because you're going to obviously spend it on healthcare anyway. But Kory, you know more than anyone. In 2007, when Harper boosted transfers by $2.3 billion, Charest took that money, immediately announced a tax cut, and used it for electoral gain in a provincial campaign. And that pissed Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper off to a fare thee well, which I think evidence of the long reach of that anger was evident just even in this last leadership contest. The second thing is, to your question, David, I'll just tell you again, I'm going to go back to my example of being on radio. I'm on talk radio these days, and I was asking people to call in on Friday, and I was astonished. This is right-wing radio, and everybody called in and said, absolutely, the premier should agree up front that the money should be spent on healthcare. Like, it wasn't even a debate. People who hate, you should see the things that people call in and write there about Trudeau. And it was just like, are we even having this argument? I don't think that the federal government can afford to wait very long. I don't think it can try to conform around political calendars. The impatience that people feel. There's a monster story here today in Toronto about a woman whose child had to be flown 350 kilometers because there was no pediatric bed in the GTA. Like, I just think this has got to get done. And if I was the prime minister, I'd write a letter to premiers right now and say, we're going to meet on the 1st of February. There are two boxes at the bottom. Please check which one best describes your attitude. Yes, I will spend every dollar on healthcare. No, I won't. And then we'll see whether or not we can get together. I just think that this thing's going to have to happen. I think it's going to have to happen relatively soon. And I do think the feds have the leverage. Whether they can get boutique programs on top of it, whether it can get very precise, I don't know. But if they can keep the question, will you spend this all on healthcare, and some reporting, I think they'll be able to muscle the provinces, and I think they should, because I think that's the right thing to do.
So if you're a long-term or even medium-term planner, you tend to want to make sure you have enough of the really vital stuff in life, well, before you run out of it. Regular listeners can guess what that stuff would be for me. Hint, it starts with an R and ends with an M, and there's only one other letter. For Canada, shipping container capacity qualifies as really vital stuff, as many of the goods we all rely on move in and out of the country in containers. Our sponsor is the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and we've been talking the last little while about how they're proposing to build a brand new marine terminal for shipping containers at the Port of Vancouver, Roberts Bank Terminal 2. Because container capacity on the West Coast is quickly diminishing, because trade needs are only growing in Canada, and the Port of Vancouver is a critical gateway for Canada's trade. Because it will strengthen the link between our country's businesses, big and small, and the global economy. Because the economic impact will be 17,300 well-paying jobs and $3 billion in additional GDP annually during terminal operations. And because, frankly, we've all had it up to here with supply chain issues, so scaling up right away will help connect Canadians with goods when they need them. But there's another key aspect to the long-term planning of this critical port project for Canada I want to talk about. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's vision is for the Port of Vancouver to be the world's most sustainable port. And one way they're focusing on meeting that vision is by working with all their partners to build a zero-emission port by 2050. You heard me right, the entire port community. Building and supporting low-emission tech initiatives in an effort to phase out all port-related emissions by 2050 is part of that vision and supports the government's goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority has a proven track record of building sustainable infrastructure projects, all while being a trusted partner of government, business, Indigenous groups, and local communities to get the job done. Jordan, let me throw a wrinkle at you here. I could loop back to our NDP conversation. So there's a lot of pressure on the Canada Health Act around the country. There's a lot of demand for provinces to be able to experiment with things, to do things differently. People see a lot of what's happening in Ontario as a prelude to privatization. At a minimum, why wouldn't the NDP make themselves the standard bearers for no private pay in the system, no matter what happens? That is the bottom line. Because I think that's where the juice in this is politically. I think that the boutique programs are I think popular with the people that they help, and they're generally presumed to be good ideas. But I don't think they move the general public the way this core idea, and the Liberals don't seem to be rising to the defense of that rhetorically the way they might have. So to me, it presents an opening for the NDP to stand for the one thing that everybody in Canada pretty much agrees on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're going to see that become more prominent in their messaging. There's no question that New Democrats are also well branded to the defense of public health care. So this is a comfortable and useful place for them to be. I think that, there is a thought also that when you look at programs like pharmacare, far from being a new entitlement, this is really fundamentally seen by New Democrats as a proper expansion of Medicare into an area that it was always designed to cover. And you see this actually in how they talk about it. They refer back to, to Tommy Douglas's original vision, which did include pharmacare. And of course, the fact that Canada is one of the only developing countries with a Medicare system in the world, developed countries that doesn't have universal pharmacare. So I think that in that sense, pharmacare in particular is not a boutique program. That's a major add-on to Medicare. That's an expansion of public health care. And that's how New Democrats will be talking about it. I do think that there is what I see missing in this conversation. There's a real there's a lack of urgency, and there's a risk that the politicians, both federal and provincial, fall behind where public opinion is on this. And I think that's a bit what Scott was alluding to with what he's hearing on talk radio. We are living, I think, through a healthcare moment that's every bit as perilous as the early days of the pandemic, and where arguably the impacts are actually far, far broader, are impacting many more people. Because when we start to see the collapse of emergency medicine, of primary health care, this ripples out, into every part of Canada, and Ontario is the canary in the coal mine on this. And so I think that if waiting until the budget or waiting until February to be seen to be taking action could be very dangerous. The sad reality is that we are already seeing cases of very sick children and worse happening because of some of these wait times and some of this lack of access to care. So, if I were there, I wouldn't necessarily want to be gambling on waiting in order to bring people to the table. I think there is some reward out there to be seen to be acting with urgency and taking leadership. So I find myself a little bit puzzled why the Prime Minister isn't taking up a bit more space on that himself right now.
There's two theories out there, Scott. Actually, Kory, this is probably throw this to you. There's two theories out there. One of which is that so pretty much as near as I can tell, all the experts think that money is important, but money isn't going to solve the problem in and of itself, that there's reforms that are necessary in the healthcare system. People point to all kinds of other jurisdictions that pay roughly what we pay and get better outcomes from their systems. So there's two theories that I hear out there. One of which is the federal government should write a very, very big check, but use that check to buy reform. Use that check to force the provinces. I mean, the provinces aren't not doing these things because they're dumb or because they're lazy. It's politically difficult to do these things. And maybe sometimes there's upfront costs associated with them.
They're also sometimes not allowed under the Canada Health Act, right?
So, may not be allowed. Okay, so the one theory is buy some change with a big federal check. The other thing is let the federation work. Let 10 different jurisdictions experiment with how they want to deliver healthcare and see what they come up with. That's the magic of federalism. Give them the money and let them see. Alberta will do one thing, Quebec will do another thing, Nova Scotia will do a third thing, and we'll see what works. Which one of those do you think has the most political salience attached to it, assuming that those are the two arguments coming from the federal and provincial side of things.
Well, there's a conflict between the politics and what I think the right policy is. Like, if you're talking about things that are different, between our system and every other, Western democracy with a robust welfare state, is we have a almost completely single payer system, and everywhere else doesn't. And there's more flexibility in terms of experimentation with that. And some areas of our healthcare system, we allow it. In other areas, we don't. In some provinces, we allow more, in others less. So you can get a private MRI in Quebec. You can get one in Saskatchewan. You can't get one in Ontario. And the enforcement of the Canada Health Act is, very disparate in terms of how the federal government does it. But there is a temptation, because of the popularity of the single payer model, for parties on the progressive side to demagogue against any experimentation, whether it comes from an NDP government in British Columbia or Saskatchewan, or a non-aligned with the traditional parties government in Quebec, and then in Ontario, there is no tolerance given for any experimentation in those areas, and therefore you don't see it, right? Like, it's. So I think there's a correct answer, which is more experimentation, more flexibility, and also more funding at the same time. But that's in conflict with where I think you see the politics going, and like what you're suggesting or advising. And I don't think it's bad political advice. I just think it's bad policy advice to demagogue against any experimentation.
Yeah, I don't want to pretend I'm a healthcare expert, but I'm not as convinced. I mean, one of the challenges for the public is that, by and large, advocates of so-called experimentation and flexibility tend to come from those who have always ideologically bristled at the idea of a single-payer system. And so people go, this isn't a circumstance, this is an agenda. And at minimum, that's vulnerable to that political characterization.
Not because that's just such a classic, attack around this. I think the desire is not about who pays, because at the end of the day, we all pay, right? Whether it's through taxes or whether it's through an insurance premium or whatever. Like, somebody is going to pay. You know that for sure. It's are you having a system where no one is left behind, where no one doesn't get healthcare covered because of their economic situation? I think every Canadian, including every Conservative, agrees that is the appropriate outcome. But I think one of the challenges, there aren't a lot of market signals within this very complex, very dynamic system. And so you get pockets of deep inefficiency. There's a reason why it's very difficult to get a driver's license from the DMV, and which is a very simple task, yet something very complicated, like getting anything you want to buy in the world shipped to your house the next day via Amazon, is something that is not done by the government. It's done by the private sector.
That may be, but if you want to really talk about reform, first of all, my general answer to your question, David, is that we should try to seek to buy reform. I think that practically and politically speaking, that the ambit of that reform should and has to be limited from the federal government. I don't think we're going to see a sequel to 2004, 2005, when we were able to actually have a list of priority procedures that would be embraced and technology funds and all that. But, to Kory's point, like, look, if we really wanted to talk about reform of the system, take the federal government out of it. You really want to alter the incentives and that. You really want to affect how much money is moving around. Bust up the fee-for-service model that guides physicians. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. I've been through those negotiations with the OMA as part of a provincial government. And to me, it's an antiquated system that absolutely invites all sorts of, incorrect incentives. And it's a ching, ka-ching, ka-ching model that's based around a notion of healthcare as it was delivered in 1977. And so, but, I don't see a bunch of conservative premiers, saying, I want to take on that fight, because, that's uncomfortable territory. And then you met up with a physician strike, and then holy crow, watch it, the fur fly politically.
And to be frank, also, I do think that there's quite a bit of provincial experimentation happening already. And some of that is the federal government looking, the other way on privatization. But some of it is, if you look at Ontario, for example, Bill 124 and capping nurses' salaries, this is part of experimentation on the part of the Ford government. And guess what? It turns out to not only be bad policy, but be unconstitutional. So I think that there is a lack of trust on the part of the feds, and rightly on the part of the public, that when you talk about modernization, you talk about experimentation, this is just code for more underfunding and more privatization. And so the trust is not there. And I think that that's really a very significant challenge that anybody on the right side of the spectrum has when they talk about reforming healthcare.
It's like this right-left thing that you're saying, though, is just such bullshit. Like, what are we talking about in terms of most provinces around this? And much of this done, by the way, by the Wynne government as well, in different areas. It is the private delivery of services under a single-payer system. Look, is Gold Ice
it's like
Clinic,
describing the majority of our health system.
And that's never disturbed me. To me, single payer is the sine qua non.
but that's there's no private pay in happening in Ontario being led by conservative governments right now. Like where you're seeing more push from provinces, including Ontario, but of every political stripe, is around private delivery. Where you're having some more market signals. Like, where do I think a good starting point for the federal government, and I mentioned this earlier, is around reporting metrics. Where one of the things that needs to happen is I think there need to be more market signals within the system. And so one of the challenges is, all right, so let's compare what's happening in this province to this province. What are the stats? How long is a wait time for a hip replacement? How long do I have to wait to get a cataract removed? Having these things, and you're seeing, I believe cataracts, for instance, the Wynne government instituted a greater deal of private delivery of those and got better results at a lower cost. And that's the sort of thing you're seeing more of. But I think, where is there a healthy role for the federal government? It's in having some sort of standardization of some of the reporting around these things. That would be a useful policy tool. That would send a market signal to provinces and healthcare systems as to whether or not you're actually using this money efficiently or not. And that would be, if you're saying leveraging money for reform, I think that would be a good reform, but it's not a prescriptive outcome-based reform. It is a prescriptive market signal reform that says, all right, now we're going to compare. So, we saw this in the education system, in the 90s, where the Harris government said, all right, we're going to have standardized testing and we're going to put all of the test scores up online, et cetera. And you can see whether or not your school's performing. And your school board can see which schools are performing within their system. And it
not sure it's a great comparison.
it provided some market signals to parents and others, and some public accountability around outcomes. I don't see what's wrong with that. I think that's a helpful tool, and that is actually leveraging money for reform.
Well, welcome back to the Monk Debates. We're going to pause now for a word from our sponsor, the World Economic Forum. I'm just kidding, but we're getting deep into policy.
So, Scott, there's some evidence from our own history of 2004 that you can ride this issue to victory. So I'm interested in Kory's allegation that the feds want to drag this out to get it closer to their electoral timeframe. Is that at all possible? Because, boy, it would be a good campaign. It would be a good campaign. It's got echoes of the old man in it. Who speaks for Canada?
Yeah, there's political jeopardy though right now, because I think there's an impatience and anxiety that's particularly inherent in the winter months, because the spike in respiratory challenges for kids in particular. And so I think that to delay for a year would be very difficult practically. I think politically it could be, if you're seen as dragging your feet for political reasons, I think that could be extraordinarily perilous. So I'm not sure that option is available. But by the way, once you kick this process off, there's lots of room for political cleavage that could, spiral you right into any number of fights. Could literally trigger you into a spring election campaign. You don't know. I mean, look at Danielle Smith. She might say, you know what, any deal is actually, boom, I get to bring my Sovereignty Act out and kiss its biceps. So let's rock. And the prime minister might say, hey, you know what the hell, man? If this is a fight you want to have, why don't we take it to every Canadian? And I'm not saying that. I'm not predicting that. I'm not sure that's a responsible, thoughtful thing to do. But you don't know. Once this ball starts to roll downhill, it can pick up speed fast.
And I'd be very interested to see what Pierre Poilievre, where he situates himself, should that be the case.
You mirror for a policy and move on back to the economy. That's, I think, what you do politically.
Hopefully for him, but I think that we've seen of late, some temptation to stray from that.
Okay. Let's move on to our third and last topic. The Angus Reed Institute did their regular check-in
Institute. It's an institute. It's like I imagine the Krypton Science Council. It's an institute. It's high foreheads.
It is more rigor than something that's not an institute. I think it was what we're supposed to gather from that.
Right.
Part of their rigor is to just ignore the existence of the province of Prince Edward Island, but I'll leave that aside.
I got that footnote too. There's very few people in this part of our country. They're hard to find. We went on the internet and everything. I don't know what the fuck.
So, anyway, a few things leap out when you look at this. I mean, the Manitoba Conservatives have just been flat on their ass for their entire term, and their leadership change hasn't helped, and they're just lying there waiting to be defeated. Time the next election comes around, Higgs looks like he's moving into that territory too in New Brunswick. On the other hand, Legault and Moe have massive support in their provinces. These kinds of 57, 56% approval ratings are outrageous, like unheard of type of things to have. Houston's up there too in Nova Scotia, hanging in strong after his election. I guess probably the two things that caught my eye were Smith numbers, not terrible at 42, certainly not Heather Stefanson numbers. Despite everything that's going on out there and our judgments of it, maybe it's not playing as badly as we had thought. And the second thing is big slide for Ford. Now, I mean, he was at highs that were unusual during some points in the pandemic and peaked again around the time of the election campaign. I would say the last time they checked in when they had him in the low 40s, that was probably sort of normal territory for Doug to be in. This is 34% favorable, and that's off 7 points from their last sounding. So I guess while we give Kory a second to gather himself, we might ask you, Scott, what would be driving that? Is it Greenbelt? Is it notwithstanding clause? Is it healthcare? What would be impacting negatively on the Ford government's reputation right now?
I guess probably two things. One is stuff that's happening to Ford, and the second is stuff that Ford is unleashing. So I think, the labor conflict, notwithstanding clause, all that controversy, the Greenbelt, I think that's a percentage of it. My guess is a larger share of the dissatisfaction is rooted in housing, the general state of the economy, the fact that we're in the middle of moving toward the middle of winter and we have all these healthcare challenges. I think, these are things that are also happening to him. He's not necessarily the author of, the architect of, he's just unlucky enough to be in office and you got to wear some of the stuff. So I think probably a bunch of that. You mentioned earlier something that I had taught you a long time ago, David, like never to open a bottle of beer with your bicuspids, always use your molars. And I'll return the favor.
We have dental coverage now, Scott. Don't worry about it.
It's a good thing. Good thing. But you taught me a long time ago when it comes to polls that when it comes to, you're looking at the categories, strongly approve, kind of maybe fucking a little bit, I don't know, if you push me up against the wall, approve kind of thing. Ignore those softy categories. Go to the extremes. Compare the hard yes and the hard no. And if you look at one thing that jumped out at me at that poll, and I'm genuinely not drawing any kind of conclusions on this, but I was sort of a bit startled by the strongly disapproved number. It's 46. Like, that's a big fucking number. And so I was kind of like, so when they do the net, it comes out at 34 or whatever. But if you just isolate the strongly disapproved number, it was 46. And that's a big chunk of the population. And I know that, it's been a rough month or two, but that tells me that the premier's got to get out of the news. That if I was Doug Ford, I would take full advantage of Christmas. I try to be working and doing the right things on basic schools and hospitals, and try to stay out of the news hole. I don't think being in the news hole has been helpful to the government. It generally isn't, particularly when times are tough and conditions are unpleasant. But they got to get out of the news hole. It's like every day somebody in that government is holding a big news conference. Every day they're driving the front page of the Toronto Star. I would get out of that business if I was the Ford government. I don't know if you agree, Kory.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's what time in the political cycle you're in. So I would agree with some of your comments that some of this is just being an incumbent in a difficult period. Like I think the healthcare stuff is probably the biggest driver, and that provinces tend to own that issue way more than the federal government, and there are challenges in the healthcare system largely because we're seeing this sort of triple wave of respiratory illnesses hit a already weakened healthcare system, and who do you hold accountable for that? The province in charge. So I think that's part of it, but I also think this is the time in the mandate where you're trying to have whatever systematic, more challenging reform or issues dealt with. And so you're trying to take your lumps up front. And I think that's what you're seeing the government doing, making changes around housing policy and the Greenbelt and things like that are more disruptive. And believe me, the government knows that some of these things are not popular. But what is popular is getting more housing built, and there's a reason why that hasn't been happening. So you want to make those changes up front. You want to take your lumps up front, and then you want to be in a better public opinion position going into the next election. I think same on healthcare. So you're seeing the government doing the same in that area too. I think all of this stuff, none of it is popular, and none of it is on the narrative that tends to make conservative governments, including the government in Ontario, more popular. When you're talking more about the economy and building infrastructure, et cetera, the government's numbers go up. When you're talking about health reform and changing rules around the Greenbelt, et cetera, your popularity goes down. But you've got to make some of these sorts of changes earlier in the mandate if you want to have the benefits of that reform later in the mandate and to have them sort of dealt with. I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better because there's basically every union in the public service is coming up for contract renewal over the next year or so. And those are also things that aren't popular. That's conflict. That's off your preferred narrative. And so that's when you take your lumps.
Jordan, I would look at these numbers of Ford's and say he was headed for defeat if he'd just not won a massive majority victory. So it leaves me wondering what these numbers actually mean and how much they mean out of context. Because if Kory can close his ears for a second, I will say that I don't think there was any great enthusiasm for Ford prior to the last election in Ontario. And I don't believe that Ford could not have been defeated in the last election campaign. But people looked at the options and they said, even if I don't love this guy or love this government, it looks like a better option than what is being put forward by the others. And that may well continue to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I see some danger in this being a little bit more than a rough period. And the reason I'll say that is that I think that, David, you're exactly right about a lack of base enthusiasm for Ford. We shouldn't mistake his victory for a great desire on the part of the people of Ontario to have him there specifically. I think that Ford was given a pass on a lot of the stuff that happened during COVID by voters. And I think that the problem right now is that there's a real mismatch in what his strengths are in terms of the story that people like to believe or like to hear about him, which is that he's in their corner fighting for regular people. And what we're seeing right now is just all the things that are not that. We're seeing, the fight with the education workers, which was in the end a losing and publicly bruising fight for him. This Greenbelt stuff, which I think is going to calcify opposition in some politically important places and galvanize people who might not have been super energized before, but now have really strong reasons to oppose the government. And I do think that these things can just be a rough period before an election, but they can also leave a mark. They can leave a mark when the story is dramatically off the one that voters like to believe about that leader. So for me, if I were advising or if I were looking at Ford government, I'd be really concerned about that mismatch and that you're not seeing very much of the things that voters find likable about Ford these days. And that Ford can't be absent for very long because there's not a really deep well of love to draw on the part of voters. So I think Kory, if you're right that it's going to be a deeply conflicted next few months in terms of labor negotiations, then I think that that's a big challenge for him, that he needs to find a way to come back on the core message and the core sort of attitude and ethos that people like about him, and he needs to do it quickly if there's not going to be lasting impacts there.
To be continued. In the meantime, it's time for Gordon Pinsent.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right. Who's up with a Hey You today?
Well, I'll go this time if you want.
Excellent. I love a volunteer.
My hey yous to the Prime Minister. It's time to sit down with the premiers. I really do. I know there's different ways that you can cut this politically, but I actually think it's the right time. I think we're seeing, because of some of the respiratory illnesses that are going around right now and the larger weakness that we have in the healthcare system across the country, now is the time to actually go in and try to do some good. And try to help get your arms around this with the premiers. There's time for politics, and there's a time for actually trying to fix stuff. And it's the fix stuff period, I think, on the healthcare stuff. And I think it's also not detached from some of the questions on immigration, et cetera, because the biggest thing that I think the premiers need help with is getting more doctors and nurses and PSWs into the system. And we can only train so many so quickly here. We need the federal government's help, I think, in terms of that. And so I think it's a great opportunity. So, hey, Prime Minister, sit down with the premiers.
Excellent. You're here. Jordan?
Mine is going out to the Liberals, and I'm a little late to the party on this because I wasn't here last week, but this is on C-21 and the firearms amendment. Just stop with the wedge politics on this stuff. This, you took a perfectly good agreement on the handgun freeze, and you squandered all that goodwill by introducing this amendment at the last minute, and you've managed, frankly, to unite a whole bunch of people who do not even want to unite against you on this. You got yourself condemned, everybody from, the AFN down to, of course, the Conservatives and even the New Democrats aren't on board for this. And I think that this is so frustrating because we do need strong and updated gun control legislation in this country. But when you pull stuff like this, it makes it very difficult to get improvements through. So please stop. Signed a New Democrat who bears the scars of this debate over many, many, many years.
Yeah, you're here to that too. Excellent. Scott?
Well, mine goes out to the media, to the commentators, to the pundits, to the chattering classes, to the us's. It goes out to the us's. And my hey you is, this evening, there will be a by-election in Mississauga Lakeshore, and everybody will tell us what it means. And you're fucking wrong, okay? I don't care what your take is, but it's almost certainly wrong. If, the Liberals defend and win a riding that they pretty much always held, except for, that gray period of the calendar known as Ignatieff election, it doesn't mean that the Prime Minister is, sturdy and strong in central Canada. If Poilievre somehow wins, that's a little more notable, I'll grant you, but it also doesn't mean that he's stampeding towards a 2011 majority victory. And if you're going to dare insult me by going on television or radio or pick up your pen and write about the margin of error, I'm going to tell you to get on the fuck off train and ride it straight to the end of the line, because it does not mean what you are saying it means. So let's just all take a collective breath. There'll be a by-election. Its significance is probably nil, and let's not get wound up.
Yeah. Exactly. So my hey you goes out to anybody watching or listening who may have ever thought that they wanted to be the Premier of Ontario. If you'd rather be the Premier of Ontario than do what you're doing now, I suggest you run for the leadership of the Liberal Party. The NDP is closed now. They picked one. And these numbers show that, like most people at the end of 2 terms, Ford is ripe to be beaten in the next election campaign. Liberal Party gives you, listen, Better chance of being premier than any other vehicle you'll ever stumble across in your life right now. Empty, sitting there, waiting, a great brand, a great vehicle, waiting for somebody to come along and pick it up off the side of the road, dust it off, and carry it to victory. So, by God, if you're somewhere in politics, I don't know who I'm talking to, and you're feeling blocked, you're feeling like it's the end of the road, take a look at this job. It's a good one. All right.
Jordan,
Thank
let's pull a page out of the Green Party book. You and I can run as co-leaders.
I like it. I like it.
Well,
You guys should.
Not sure voters would.
If you can find somebody. I don't know. Is Ignatieff still around?
Actually, I've got an idea for all of us right now.
Kory.
While we were on this call, they've just upped the reward for finding the killer of the Shermans to $35 million. So I'm going to go hit the streets looking for that.
Come shoot.
Anybody want to join me? I'll cut you in on the reward money. All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsors, CN and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. I'd like to thank everybody who watched or listened, and of course, Kory and Jordan and Scott for joining me today. Thanks so much for doing that. And we'll be back next week with more Curse of Politics. See you then.